Salvation sat and crossed herself and called the devil partner. Winston burns up on a shelf who'll kill the raging cancer.
Do you want to hear a scary story? Yeah. In the early days of the Depression, there was a bank robber who pulled a heist out in Tarrant County, and he's racing along this ridge away from the cops when he hit a pothole, sending him careening down a hillside, rolling the car and slamming him into a tree. He managed to climb out of the car as he heard sirens getting closer and staggered his way to a clearing where he saw an old man sitting on a stump. "Help me," the bank robber shouted. "I'll do anything." "Anything?" the old man asked in a voice that sent shivers up the injured man's spine. He smiled wickedly and snapped his fingers. Suddenly, the man felt an awful pain in his gut and passed out. When he awoke, his feet had turned to hooves. Covered in coarse hair, he had 2 horns coming out of the top of his head. He had fiery eyes, sharp teeth, and pointy ears. He was no longer injured, but instead had an unquenchable thirst for blood. He had become the Goatman. That's one of a handful of stories I grew up hearing around the bonfire at campgrounds all over North Texas. When I think of those fall nights around the campfire with my dad, I instantly hear the whine of cicadas and remember the smell of thick smoke. More than anything else, though, I think of the Goatman. Growing up, I dreamed of becoming an astronaut. I loved seeing the stars, pointing out constellations, and hearing the stories around the campfire about Orion and the Gemini twins. And the stories always got scarier as the night went on, and the Goatman stories were always saved for last. A spine-tingling cry from the Goatman always rang in my ears as I walked back to my tent. Goatman! Imagine being 8 and hearing that. So on those nights, as I laid down on the ground to go to sleep, my heart fluttered with fear. I knew the stories of the Goatman had to be just stories, and I'd remind myself to brush them off, but somewhere deep down, I was genuinely terrified. What if the Goatman was real? Telling and hearing the stories was always fun, but it still made for sleepless nights. Every snap of a twig announced a grotesque hoof getting closer. Every snore from a nearby tent was the guttural growl of the monster thirsting for blood. Though I never came face to face with the Goatman, a specter scarier than any other boogeyman, I continued to tell stories about him. After graduating college in Indiana, I returned to Texas and started a gig at the Dallas Morning News, where I interned and aimed to earn a spot on staff. One day, my editor asked me for new story ideas, and without anything good, I scrambled. Well, there's this Goatman thing. Out at Lake Worth, they have a celebration about the monster every year. There's these campfire stories I used to hear as a kid. I fumbled through a half-assed pitch, but to my surprise, my editor put me on the story immediately. I found that most of the Goatman stories traced back to the hot, lazy summer of 1969 along the West Fork of the Trinity. There was a clearing near Greer Island surrounded by high bluffs, which was a popular spot for teenagers to go engage in all manner of nocturnal activities. One night, 2 couples saw something so terrifying they ran straight to police. They claimed that a giant creature covered in scales leapt onto their car, damaging it. The thing put an 18-inch gash in the side of the car and tried to grab one of the women. The papers reported the next day under the headline, "Fishy man goat terrifies couples parked at Lake Worth." The next night, according to the papers, the clearing was flooded with people trying to spot the creature. Spectators drank and smoked, waiting for the monster when it suddenly appeared on a ridge. The monster roared and threw a tire clear across the crowd, causing the spectators to flee in fear. The Goatman caused a region-wide panic. Groups came to see and even hunt the monster. A few more sightings were recorded over the years, but nothing quite as exciting as that summer at Greer Island. During my research, I called the man who was park director in 1969, and he told me about a group of teenage pranksters who dressed in all black and pretended to be the monster. One of those pranksters was still alive, but my best efforts to track this man down resulted in a dead end. The story ran in July, and I moved on, eventually earning a staff job where I focused on less monstrous stories. To my surprise, a few months later, on Halloween Day, I received a phone call from a man who had seen my story. The caller claimed that the monster was his uncle, whose phone number he passed along to me. Out of the blue, I had in my hand the phone number to a real man named Billy Shelby who had inspired all those stories from the campfire. All I had to do was call. It took me nearly 5 months to get the courage to do so. Now, I cold call people in my job all the time, but this wasn't a local politician or a football coach. This was the Goatman. Thinking of picking up the phone made my heart start racing. And even though the idea of seeking out the Goatman made the 12-year-old inside my head terrified, I finally mustered up some courage and called him. Hello? The voice was harsh, like a Texas brush pile, with that syrupy twang that only exists west of Fort Worth. Well, funny story, actually. I got a call from your nephew because I did a story in the summer about the Lake Worth monster. Yes. And he said you have a family connection? Yes. On a drizzly, humid morning a few weeks later, I drove out to his tin-sided house, just a stone's throw down Jacksboro Highway from Greer Island. Billy Shelby was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in. He had wrinkled skin, dark curly hair, and a thick gray mustache. He wore bifocals over green eyes and smiled as his sister Jan started talking about that memorable summer. Before I could even sit down, though, Billy had grabbed his keys. "Come on," he said cheerfully, "we're going for a ride." Now, as a reporter, getting in the car with someone you're writing about is a goldmine. People automatically fill the silence by talking and telling stories. But as someone who has feared the Goatman for over a decade, I was a little apprehensive. As we drove down the gravel roads, Billy and Jan described their wild youths, living and working in their father's liquor store, playing in the woods, and causing trouble at every turn. Billy drove past the store where they'd steal beer before heading into the woods. And when we got to the clearing, Billy jumped out of the car and bounded up the hillside like he was 15 years old again, dodging tree branches and thorny vines. "This is where we'd play. This is our backyard," he said. He showed me the ridge where he stood as a teenager and pretended to be the monster. He threw a tire, showing how it rolled all the way across the clearing like in 1969. I couldn't get over the fact that I was trekking through the woods with the man who had inspired such fear in me as a child. Turns out it was just a rowdy teenager who, like me, enjoyed playing in the woods. Last weekend, I went camping with a buddy of mine in East Texas. Our campsite was next to a group of young boys chasing each other around the campground. They were about the age I was when I first learned about the Goatman. I heard the boys telling scary stories and screaming in the campfire-lit night, and they reminded me of me and of the Goatman. Because just like a teenage Billy Shelby, they were having fun running around the forest. And just like me, they were enjoying a father-son campout, complete with all the requisite campfire stories. I may have pulled back the curtain by entering the tin-sided den of the Goatman and learning the true story, but those tales and the memories of camping in the Texas woods make up an important part of my childhood. And, all these years later, the gruff-voiced Goatman continues to echo across the water.